And we joined via Skype by Happy Khambule, Greenpeace Africa's senior political advisor. He is in Poland for the COP24 climate change gathering. A very good evening to you, Mr. Khambule. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, the Poland gathering, what does the agenda hinge squarely on?
Good evening to everybody. Well, the agenda basically hinges on a number of issues, but primarily it hinges on the fact that when they agreed the 2015 Paris Agreement, they weren't sure about what rules would be governing the agreement itself. So in terms of taking the necessary steps to avert climate change, whether you're doing your mitigation action to reduce your emissions or trying to adapt to climate change, the countries hadn't made sure that they had the right rules. So they had put in a time period in which they would develop these rules. But since the COP21 agreement came in early, what has happened is that they had to accelerate the whole process of agreeing the rules. And essentially what hinges, or what this conference hinges on is the rules of the game, or the rules of reducing all these emissions and how you account for the emissions, what money comes in and what money goes out, is based on.
Now, we also understand that nations do have a choice in line with the Paris Agreement to decide how they will curb emissions. Is this perhaps the best approach?
Well, we've tried a different approach as a global community to say each nation will reduce on average a particular amount of emissions, and that didn't work very well. This is the only, well, for the time being, this is the best solution we've got. Because every country basically decided that this is the only way in which they can contribute to addressing climate change by deciding by themselves what they would like to put forward. The tricky part about all of this is that how do we then determine if what the country is putting forward is fair, and whether or not it takes into account the country's developmental and historical responsibility, and whether or not that country is requiring some form of support, or it's requiring some time to go through the process of development.
Just how far are we from a low carbon economy? I mean, if we still have big economies like Japan and China being one of the biggest drivers of the biggest carbon dioxide emitters?
Well, that's a very good question, because I think we're quite far away. But the thing that we can all be appreciative of is that the technology is there for people to use immediately. So we've got the necessary technologies to move us closer to a zero carbon world. The question is whether or not countries like the United States and China, are they ready to do that immediately? It seems like they're not at this point in time. South Africa is one country as well, which being at home, we also have to battle the fact that we need to move into a low carbon generation type of thinking, but we still have this big coal and gas deposits that we would want to use. But because we know that we can't use them anymore, because if we continue using them, we're causing more of the problem, we really need to make that hard decision to say we need to go zero very soon. Most people are saying by 2030 for developed countries, and for countries like South Africa, they're talking about 2050.
Indeed, and we understand the year's most important meeting on climate change is currently underway in Poland this week, with one glaring absence: a high-level US presence. What does this tell you?
Well, what it tells us is that it seems like the USA or the United States is really following through with their threat, or rather their intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. But it's not like the United States negotiating the different thematic areas. It's whether or not the highest level of the United States administration is available. That is a big question. But essentially, they've already intended and communicated their intention to leave the Paris Agreement, and it seems like they're following through with that.
And the increasing dangers posed by climate change for Africa in particular?
Well, I think we in South Africa know very well the impacts of climate change, from the rain bombs that we felt last year in Johannesburg and in Pretoria, to the almost day zero occurrence in Cape Town, and the day zero occurrence in some Eastern Cape societies and communities. We know that water is one of our biggest resource, one of our scarcest and biggest, most important resources in South Africa. And if climate change continues to happen in that way. It's not only going to affect South Africa, it's going to affect sub-Saharan Africa. And as you have also shown from the report, that countries such as Ethiopia and Nigeria, and particularly South Sudan, that have been undergoing high intensive droughts, this is going to become more of a normal thing. And if we don't address it, it's just going to be more and more worse. But we do have an opportunity to address it, but not only by reducing our emissions, but also adapting to the situation. So finding ways to read the patterns of the changes in order to make sure that we are able to adjust our way of working and the way we live.
Mr. Khambule, take us through the other climate protection agreements reached by the different countries and the targets that have been set.
Well, there's been essentially three, let's say, agreements. The most notable agreement is the one that brought everybody together in 1992, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the agreement that basically brought people to the table to discuss about climate change. So that is the most supreme body and the most supreme source of information, including an agreement on climate change governance in the world. But then there was something called the Kyoto Protocol, which was only for developed countries, because at the time, developed countries such as the United States, the EU, and Japan, and all the others, they basically knew that the problem of climate change was as a result of their actions. And as time went on and the global economic situation started to change, and countries such as China and India started to play much of a bigger role, they then saw that actually it's not only them that need to take a stand on this or to try to address climate change. They need to bring in developing countries, especially developing countries that have a high emitting capability and also have the potential, when they're undertaking climate change responses, to be able to shift in a much quicker way than they are able to as developed country parties. So for such inclusion. So obviously another bunch of countries around the world said, well, we've got a place to play or a role to play in this, and then we ended up with the Paris Agreement in 2015. But it's been a slow and programmatic process to get from when it was just the developed country parties and people who were interested in climate change to just when the developed country parties said we can deal with this by ourselves, to finally seeing that it is impossible to do it by yourselves. You actually literally need every single person in the world to believe and to agree to this agreement and work towards it. So the different targets, I think the Kyoto Protocol had on average for developed countries about 5% reduction. And for developing countries that wanted to participate, there wasn't any really real target on it. It's only when we got the COP21 agreement, which we call the Paris Agreement, where countries undertook bigger and more stronger targets. Well, for South Africa, it's a bit different, where we spoke about maybe we will stop increasing our emissions by 2050, by 2025 up to 2045. Up to from 2025 to 2035, and we'll be reducing our emissions from then on. But it's always been a slow progress towards making sure that we actually implement what we've said, and also to increase the ability for us to decrease our emissions.
And speaking of the ability to decrease emissions, we understand that greenhouse gas emissions rose sharply in 2018. Why?
We can always say that it's political will, but also it's the fact that we've got industries that have been around for centuries and centuries. And if we look at the things that we use all the time, our electricity is coal-fired. In other countries, it's powered by gas or it's powered by oil. In some other places, they're using gas for transport. Some places are using oil, for example, with us, for transportation, and other industries are using fossil fuels. So the continued use of fossil fuels and the fact that our economies are based on fossil fuel use and the development of fossil fuels makes it so that whenever there is a drop in emissions, somehow in some way there's a drop in some form of productivity. And until we start switching away from this high intensive fuel use or emissions and fossil fuel use, we're going to keep on seeing either an increase year on year, or we're going to see a slow decrease, but it will not look like a real decrease, because essentially it will be a decrease in relation to what would have been before we had our plans. And what we need to do is to implement our plans 100% and not by 20% and not by 30%, but implement all our plans in order to reduce our emissions. If all the countries in the world undertake their commitments and reduce their emissions, the world is still going to be having an increase, a temperature increase on average of about 3 to 4%, for 3 to 4 degrees. And on average in Africa, that will give us about 6 to 5 degrees.
All right, Mr. Khambule, thank you so much for breaking that down for us. That's Happy Khambule, the Greenpeace Africa's political advisor.